All right, so thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you about Claudia Goldin and her research and why I think it's really very important. Obviously, the rest of the economics profession has recognized that her work is important because she is this year's Nobel Prize recipient. You guys can see my slides all right? Everything looks good? All right. So just a little bit of background on who Claudia Goldin is. So she was born in New York. She was born to a Jewish family. She went to her undergrad at Cornell, studied economics there. And then she went on to get her PhD from the University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago is one of the top economics programs in the world. And when she was there, she worked with an economic historian by the name of Robert Fogel and a labor economist. Well, Gary Becker, he's an everything. He's not just a labor economist. He does some work in labor economics. He does some work on the economics of crime. He is also a Nobel Prize winner. So she worked pretty closely with those two scholars. And her research kind of reflects that those were two of her biggest intellectual influences, because her research kind of combines economic history with kind of labor economics to understand questions that are related to women's labor force participation. One of the things that I absolutely love is that she is married to another economist by the name of Lawrence Katz, and they co-author lots and lots and lots of papers together. So they're a really productive working economics team. And so when you look at the announcement for this year's Nobel Prize, what the committee says she wins this prize for is for having advanced our understanding of women's labor market outcomes. And it also talks about her work that helps us understand a little bit about understand a lot about the factors that kind of drive the gender wage gap. So she's one of the first people to give us a very comprehensive analysis of how women's labor market participation has changed throughout the centuries. Her work dispels some popular kind of common fallacies that people have. One of the fallacies that her work dispels is this idea that women never worked outside of the home until World War II, and then we went into the factories and we, Rosie the Riveter, and we did, we entered the labor force then. But that's not true. And so her historical work will kind of show that women historically were a big part of the labor force, but things changed as the nature of the economy has changed. So before we get started with the specifics of her research, because she talks a lot about the gender wage gap, I just want to give some background about what the gender wage gap is and kind of what we think it means versus what it does not mean. So the gender wage gap is a statistic that gets talked about a lot at every March during International Women's Month. And you hear lots and lots of people talking about the gender wage gap. As of last year, the gender wage gap for the United States was about 17 cents. So women on average make 83% of the hourly wages that men do. And a lot of people look at that number and assume that it's kind of comparing apples to apples. A lot of people look at the gender wage gap and think that what the gender wage gap means is that a woman who's doing the exact same job as a man who has the exact same education and experience is getting 13% less than what the man gets for doing the same work. That's not what the gender wage gap actually measures. The gender wage gap actually takes all working men, regardless of what their educational background looks like, what their experience in the labor market looks like, and what kind of occupation they're doing, and it lumps them together and it looks at what their average hourly wage is. Then it takes all of the working women, and regardless of their education, their training, their experience, and regardless of their occupation, and takes an average and looks at their average hourly wage, and then it compares the two groups together. So it's not comparing apples to apples, because if a lot of men are choosing different labor market, different occupational paths, if they're choosing different majors in college, if they're making systematically different choices about whether or not they're going to take breaks from the labor force throughout their career, then that's going to result in basically kind of the main driver of the gender wage gap is those choices. So I just wanted to kind of give some background on that, because I am going to talk about the gender wage gap a bit. And so I wanted to make sure we're on the same page about what that means. But her work, Claudia Goldin's work, is one of the main bodies of research that really unpacks what is driving the gender wage gap. What does that gender wage gap look like in different occupations? Maybe the gender wage gap is bigger for some occupations than others. And she really gives us a nice, rich understanding of what drives those gender differences. So her broad economic research agenda, I'm taking a quote directly from her, the speech that she gave when the Nobel Prize was announced. She talked about working on many different subjects in the field of economic history before she discovered her calling, which is the study of women and gender. So one of the things that is interesting is that, economics itself is a somewhat male-dominated field. And when we're doing research, we kind of focus on the things that are important to us. And the things that are important to us are things that, that's influenced by our past experiences, the lives that we've lived, right? So the questions that I'm interested in asking with my research, my past experiences have influenced and shaped those questions a lot. And my past experiences have shaped what I think the answers to those questions might be. So when you're in a profession that is dominated by a large portion, when that profession has a lot of people who have similar kind of experiences, if you have not a lot of diversity in the profession, then you're going to get, questions that might be interesting to that group of people, but might not have a broad appeal to everybody else. So in economics, we tend to be a very male-dominated field. Not just male-dominated, it's a very white field, and it's a field where most of the practitioners are from family backgrounds that are pretty privileged. So most economists have parents that have also gone on to have graduate degrees. And so at the time when Claudia Goldin was going to graduate school and kind of working on building her research agenda, there weren't many people asking questions about women specifically, and what are the things that shaped women's labor force participation. Not because it was a malicious plan on the economics profession not to ask these questions. It's just that if it's not part of your experience, that might not be on your radar as being important. So in her graduate work, she didn't start off by investigating questions about women's labor force participation. She started off by exploring questions related to the Civil War. And through doing archival work and investigating questions related to the Civil War, she realized that a lot of women, when the world was an agricultural society, largely dominated by agricultural production, women participated in the labor force a lot. Most women were working. But as the world started to change, then those labor force dynamics started to change. And so she really got interested in understanding why. So she's taking two fields in economics, economic history and labor economics, and kind of combining them together to give us a rich understanding of what women's labor market experience has been historically. And her work is largely focused on the United States. Because she is an economic historian, actually, if you Google her and you look at her Wikipedia page, it lists her as a historian, not even an economist or an economic historian. The first way she's listed as a historian. So she really digs deep into what did the world look like in these historical time periods that she's trying to understand. She looks through tons of archival research, tries to understand what the laws and the rules were like, tries to understand a bit about the culture of the time, so that she's not just kind of looking at statistics, right? Those are a lot of her labor economics tools. She does a lot of statistical analysis, but she combines that with her economic history tools to give us a really rich understanding of what's going on. So the first paper of Claudia Goldin's that I want to talk about is called The Quiet Revolution That Transformed Women's Employment, Education, and Family. And this paper, I want to start here because this paper is actually a summary of a lot of her earlier work. It pulls together a lot of the insights that she's had. So if we are going to dig into, if there's one thing, if you were like, I want to read one and only one paper by Claudia Goldin, this would be the one that I recommend, because it does tie so much of her earlier work together. And so this is the paper where she is really refuting that popular myth that women didn't enter the workforce until World War II. If you look at this picture, this is what we call a U-shaped labor force participation. So along the bottom axis, we have the year over time, and it's going all the way back to 1790 through the late 1970s. And on the y-axis, you can't see it, it got cut off as I was formatting this, but that shows women's labor force participation. So what percentage of the female population is actively engaged in some sort of formal economic production? So when you look, did somebody have a question? Sorry. Okay. When you take a look at the actual data, you'll see that women's labor force participation, yes, it did start to increase during World War II. But if you look back earlier, right, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, lots of women were participating in the labor force. As we shift from an agricultural society to a more industrial society, the nature of work started to change, right? Industrial work, when everybody is working on kind of subsistence level farming, kind of the whole family has to get involved. The kids, the wife, the husband, everybody has to get involved in production to help meet your living standards. As we start to get a different type of economy, as we start to have the Industrial Revolution and we start to have more factory type of work outside of the home, then women's labor force participation started to fall off a little bit. It bottoms out in the early 1900s, and then it starts picking up again. After 1910, we start to see it come up. So they call this the U-shaped labor force participation, because as you can see, it's shaped like a U. So in this paper, The Quiet Revolution, there's a couple of insights that she gets to. What are the factors that have influenced women's choices to either enter the labor force or refrain from entering the labor force? One thing she mentions is changes in time horizons. So are you thinking about your labor force participation as a short-term situation, or are you thinking about your labor force participation as something that's going to be more long-term? if you think that if you go into, life thinking that you're not going to be participating in the labor force for very long, that maybe you'll only work if your family really, really needs you to, that's going to lead you to make different decisions about education and preparing for careers than if you are starting from the expectation that you're probably going to be part of the labor force for a really long time. So time horizons had to shift. Changes in people's identity had to shift. Are you seeing things more as a job, or are you seeing things more as a career? Do you view yourself as a wife and mother primarily, or do you have some other identity that you are fixing on? And the last thing is the change in decision-making power. So when we're talking about whether or not women want to participate in the labor force, typically we're focusing on kind of married couples that are male-female. And in that marriage, you have a negotiation that you're going through in terms of who is going to be more responsible for the household duties, like cooking and cleaning and taking care of children, and who's going to be primarily responsible for earning an income. And so every household has to navigate that decision, whether we're in a male-female relationship, we're in a same-sex relationship. Every couple has to navigate that dynamic, but at different points in time, men may have had a bigger say in that negotiation process than women. So we'll talk about some of the things that changed their negotiation power. One thing that, just a little economic background, one of the things that she does in this paper is she separates women's labor force participation decision into two distinct effects, an income effect and a substitution effect. So when the income effect tends to dominate, what the income effect tells us is if we have higher incomes, we will consume more goods that are considered normal goods. So leisure is considered a normal good. If I have a higher income, I'm going to want to take more vacations. I'm going to choose to work less. So during periods of time where income effects were dominant, that would mean that a slight increase in household income would have resulted in women leaving the labor market en masse. In periods of time where we have the substitution effect being dominant, well, that tells us, what is the relative cost of leisure versus work. So when the substitution effect is dominant, when wages are high, it's more costly for me to take time off because I'm giving up a bigger amount of salary. I'm giving up a bigger reward. So at other periods in history, the substitution effect is going to be dominant, showing that slight changes in income it's not going to be household income that really determines whether or not women participate in the labor force. It's going to be what kind of wage can I earn that is going to determine, be the primary driver of the decision. So I also just wanted to make sure we have a little background on income and substitution effects so that we can make more sense of her results. So she divides this time period. She looks at things in 4 different phases. Phase 1 is that late 1800s to the early 1920s, which she calls the independent female worker. And she unpacks kind of the historical conditions that were present during this time period and looks at, what did a female worker look like during this time period? Well, women who were working outside of the home at that time period were generally really young. They were generally very unmarried, not very well educated, and from households that were very low income, often immigrant households. The type of work that women were able to do during this time was either in industrial manufacturing, which can be dirty and repetitive, or in kind of domestic service, so cooking and cleaning and child rearing activities for other wealthier families, which is also maybe dirty, repetitive, and comes with long hours. So there was a social stigma attached to working outside of the home during this time period. If you were a woman that was working outside of the home, you pretty much identified your family as a low income, not well educated family. So there was, you didn't want to have to work if you didn't have to. If your family could afford you not to work, it was much more desirable to stay home. There weren't a ton of professional seeming jobs, or very few professional seeming careers. Some careers like being a teacher or being a nurse did exist at the time, and women did enter into those fields, but there were laws on the books that dictated that women who got married would need to leave their position. Like, a woman couldn't be a married teacher in the United States. You would have to quit your job once you were married. So those types of laws are called marriage bars. Though that kind of legal context was pretty relevant. So the type of work was dirty and kind of demeaning. There was a lot of social stigma attached for not just the woman who was working outside of the home, but the entire family, right? What kind of your husband wouldn't be seen as a very good provider if you're not earning enough money that your wife has to go to work. So this means that during this particular time period, the income effect was going to be dominant. So a woman's choice to enter the labor market or not really was heavily influenced by the necessity of the household. And even if you had an opportunity to take a job with pretty high wages, if your husband was earning enough money, it was likely that the woman would not take that job. They would rather not work at all than take a high-paying job during this time period because of kind of those social factors attached to women's work. Then in the second phase, this is the 1930s through the 1950s. So this is kind of that Great Depression, World War II kind of era where we see, it is true that we see women entering the labor force to a great degree during this time period. And not just single women, but married women were also entering the labor force in mass. And so part of the driver behind this is that there were new types of jobs becoming available. There was a demand for professional type of clerical work and office work, which is cleaner and less physically intensive than working in a factory or working as a housekeeper for some wealthy family. At the same time period, we saw women staying in high school longer. My grandmother, she was born in the early 1900s, so she was born in like 1918, and she only went to school through 7th or 8th grade. She did not go to high school. But had she been born a little bit later, during the late 20s, early 30s, she would have been much more likely to go to school through high school. Having a longer time in your basic, K through 12 education would have meant that she would have had skills that would have helped her be more successful in the labor market. So during this time period, we start to see more girls staying in school a little bit longer. We start to see more respectable type of jobs emerge. And we also started to see part-time jobs become possible. So shorter hours, maybe I don't have to work full time. I can work part of the day. And we also started to see some laws change. So this is easing the constraints on women's work, those marriage bars that I mentioned were largely eliminated throughout the 1940s. Now, part of that might be because we needed women to work during the war, but that legal restriction was relaxed. So this means the income effect, because of the reduction in the stigma, because the availability of better jobs, the income effect started to wane. So even if your husband was making really, really good money, your family was pretty well off, that was less likely to deter you from entering the labor force. The substitution effect became a lot more important. That availability of nice professional jobs, part-time work with flexible schedules, that started to become important. And another thing she points out as being really important during this time period are time-saving innovations. So what I mean by that are things like vacuum cleaners and washing machines and microwaves and conventional ovens. All of the things that we take very much for granted today are things that got, and maybe not invented right then in that time period, but they became available to a larger audience during that time period, which means it makes people, maybe women still had to do the household work, the cooking, the cleaning, and the child rearing. However, with the time-saving innovations, they can get those jobs done a lot faster, which allowed them to have more time that they can then use to get a part-time job. So all of these factors were really working together to increase women's labor force participation during the 1930s to the 1950s. Then we start to move into the 50s to the 70s. This phase 3 is what she calls the roots of the revolution. So it's not the revolutionary period just yet, but it's where the seeds get really planted here. So we start to see a steady increase in women's labor force participation, not just the young and unmarried women, not just the younger married women, but older women started joining the labor force as well. We start to see women become very, very responsive to what those wages can look like. So women were starting to become more highly educated, not just going through high school, but to now start to enter into college to a greater degree. And so the average woman who was working was much more highly educated than the average woman who wasn't working, which means this idea that if I build my human capital, I can enter the labor force and get a higher wage. That enticement of a higher wage started to encourage more women to build their human capital. We started to again see an increase in more part-time jobs. And we started to see a shift in social norms. So women were a little bit more welcome, not completely welcome, but a little bit more welcome in the labor force. But it was still the case during this time period that women were considered to be secondary wage earners. So the husband is the primary breadwinner. The husband is making more of the financial decisions. And it was the case that most of the jobs that women had didn't really have a lot of advancement or opportunities for advancement and training. Jobs were still jobs. They weren't careers. But one of the things she highlights as being really important during this time period is that the women who were joining the labor force in the 1950s to the 1970s, even though they were starting to go to college, they were still not anticipating being in the labor force their entire lives. They were still anticipating that maybe they would work for a short period of time, but they would be able to drop out of the labor force and raise kids. They weren't preparing for a lifelong career. So going to college was really viewed as a way to meet a husband. They used to call it getting your MRS degree instead of getting your MS degree. You're getting your Mrs. degree. And so women were going to college not necessarily to prepare themselves for a long career, but they were going to college in the hopes that they would meet a husband who has high earning potential, and that at some point in the not too distant future, they would be able to drop out of the labor force and focus on staying at home and taking care of the family. So there was still this kind of separation of career and then family, not both at the same time. So the reason this is called the roots of the revolution is because what is important is that women's daughters, the daughters that were growing up during this time period and watching their mothers, their mothers had this anticipation that they weren't going to be in the labor force for that long, but it turned out that their expectations were not matching with reality. The daughters saw the poor planning on the part of their mothers and started to kind of update their expectations. So this is where the 1970s to today, the phase that she actually calls the Quiet Revolution. So the women growing up during that time, they saw their mother's plans be kind of thwarted because of the divorce rate started going up pretty dramatically during this time period. So a woman who has the expectation that they're not going to be in the labor force that long, they're just going to they're going to work a little bit and then focus on family. Then you get divorced, and now suddenly you have to be in the labor force a lot longer than you anticipated. You're going to spend most of your life there. And they were ill prepared for that situation. They did not build the human capital necessary and get the professional training necessary to enable them to build lots of careers. And so the daughters saw this happening and said, this is not going to happen to me. My time horizons are shifting. I don't want to end up like my mom, having to work in a job that's pretty low paying with no opportunity for advancement just because my marriage didn't work out. Right. So we started to see a change in the time horizons. I'm thinking more long term in terms of what my labor force participation is going to be like, which means I'm now going to make different choices about what type of human capital to build, because I want the training that's going to enable me to move up throughout a career, have an actual career, not just a job. This also started to shift women's identities. So during this time period, the age at which women started to get married for the first time started to be later and later in life. At the same time, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, the birth control pill, contraceptive pill, became really, really widespread, available, pretty cheap. It's also the time period after Roe versus Wade. So abortion access was protected by the Supreme Court. And so that gave women a lot of control over whether and when they could have a kid. So this kind of shift in identity, now instead of viewing yourself as just a potential wife or a mother, you start to develop your own identity. You start to get married after you went to college, right? And so college wasn't about finding a husband, it was about preparing for a career. And so this is when we really, really started to see not just the labor force participation rate of women skyrocket, but we start to see their wages go up too. We really start to see the gender wage gap start to narrow a bit during this time period. This great little illustration that I found on the Nobel website, it's talking about the expectations and the opportunities, right? That the women in the 1970s, looking at their parents' experience, starts to shape their expectations differently. So it puts them on a completely different career path. And that's the world that we're living in today, where most women anticipate that they're going to be in the labor force for a really long time. They're making decisions to go to college for themselves and building the careers that they really want to get fulfillment out of. And we actually are seeing more women going to college today than men, actually. So college attainment rates are higher for women than for men. We're still making some different choices about what to major in, and that does have implications for the gender pay gap. So now I want to move on to talk a little bit about some of the other papers that she has done that I think are really interesting. So she has some papers exploring the dynamics of the gender wage gap. This is one of the papers that she has co-authored with her husband. And in this paper, they look at men and women who graduate from MBA programs, and they try to track them throughout their career as their career progresses. So they're looking at men and women who have similar training, right? They both have these professional MBA degrees. They're both working in similar types of sectors and fields. And so they track their career and they track their wages throughout kind of their career. And they find that the gender wage gap when they first start is pretty narrow, right? When they're at the very beginning of their careers, men and women with similar training in similar fields are making almost the same amount. But about 10 to 16 years after they graduate, we start to see this big divergence between men's earnings and women's earnings. And so some of the findings from this paper is they find that these differences between male and female earnings grow because of interruptions to our careers, so taking time out of the labor force, and differences in the types of hours we're working. So finance and corporate sector is pretty demanding. If you want to do really well in finance, you might work long hours, you might have to travel a lot. And so if you are a woman and you're married and you want to have a kid, it's really hard to have a job with lengthy, demanding hours that are unpredictable, that might require lots of travel. Because if you are going to be the caregiver, you are expected to be kind of on call. It's easier to care for children if you have a career that's more flexible. So taking a break because you had a kid and you want to take time out of the labor force, being the on-call parent who has to go to school to pick up the sick kid, all of those things influenced the decisions that men and women make about hours to work, how much time to take away. And as a result, our career, we deviate, the gender gap deviates quite a lot as people progress through their careers. So we have another illustration kind of showing, right, at the beginning, men and women kind of have equal footing in the labor market. But then as soon as we start to have decisions about family, having kids, because the expectation is that the woman is going to bear the larger portion of responsibility for that type of caring labor, men can kind of continue on an upward income trajectory, but women who take breaks from the labor market, a break of 6 months or more from the labor market is going to make your skills pretty outdated. There's a pretty big wage penalty that comes from taking breaks from the labor force, and there's wage penalties that come from flexibility in the hours. If we have time later, I'll talk a little bit about gender norms, because how we network and the things that we do to help us get ahead in our jobs are often difficult for the primary caregiver to participate in. it's really hard to go to that networking happy hour where you might talk with some prospective clients and kind of woo them if you need to be home with the kids. So women are going to systematically tend to make different choices about those types of things that really hurt them throughout their career. Another thing that Claudia Goldin's work identifies is that industries that have high flexible hours are going to be ones where they're more friendly to women. So this is kind of just actually summarizing a little bit of what I just said previously, but in the professions and occupations that tend to be high earning professions, so lawyers, a surgeon, financial planners that are, stockbrokers, these higher earning professional occupations, you get benefits from working long hours. So if you end up working less than 40 hours, or if you end up really desiring a flexible work schedule, in a lot of these high-paying industries, you're going to get a penalty. And because women tend to be the primary caregivers, they are the ones that are likely to suffer from that penalty. Now, it is not necessarily the case that women have to be the ones suffering from that penalty. Right? The negotiation about how household labor is divided is a decision that gets made between the couple itself. And it might be the case that the man decides to stay home and be the primary caregiver. But more often than not, women tend to take on that role. So systematically, it is going to be the case that women are going to incur this penalty. One of my favorite papers that she's worked on is about how can we alleviate gender discrimination in orchestras. Again, she's looking at historical data. There's records about the gender identity of people who try out for different orchestras. And they wanted to ask the question, blind auditions, do they actually help increase gender equality in orchestras? So it used to be the case, the vast majority of orchestra participants were male. And initially, when they started to introduce blind auditions, they would put a screen up and people would walk out onto the stage and they would audition. And they found at first that the screen wasn't really reducing gender discrimination because you could still hear people's shoes walking across the stage. And so even though you were behind a screen, if somebody's walking across the stage and you hear the clicking of high heels, you know it's a woman. And if you hear nice soft footsteps, you knew it was a man. So the first thing they had to do was change the way blind auditions were structured. So they put the screen, but then they also put down a carpet to soften the footsteps. And now we have this natural experiment where we have a switch in how orchestra tryouts were conducted, with a screen and a carpet to help conceal the identity of people trying out. And they got to build this pretty robust data set because orchestra participants, musicians, they often try out for different cities. If I didn't make the orchestra in Dallas, I could try out in Seattle, or I could try out in Washington, D.C. So what they could see over time is you might have the same men and women trying out for different orchestras, but then at some point in that time series, we now get the introduction of the blind audition. So you can kind of have a natural experiment to see if people had success. Knowing the identity of people who tried out also allows you to control for kind of the talent. So what they found is that having blind auditions actually increased the odds that a woman was going to advance to a later stage in the hiring by 50%, which is pretty good. but it increased the likelihood that women would actually be hired by a factor of 7. They were now 7 times more likely to actually get the job. The blind audition process, through a lot of their statistical techniques, they control for a lot of different things. They found that about 30% of the improvement in women's representation in orchestras can be attributed to the introduction of these blind auditions. So that gives us some policy implications if we're trying to think about, how could we improve gender balances in our own hiring practices at our own places of employment. We can think about how can we introduce kind of a blind audition in some of our own hiring practices. I already mentioned before the power of contraception. Contraceptives was discussed in her Quiet Revolution paper, but she has an entire paper where she and her husband talk about the importance of the pill and just how it relaxed some constraints on women's ability to participate in the labor force. One of the things it did is help even out kind of bargaining power within the household. I can shift the timing of when I want to have a kid. I can make it so that it's much less likely that I get accidentally pregnant, and that takes me away from the labor force or takes me away from my studies. So just the availability of autonomy over your reproductive capabilities really opened up women's labor force participation. It reduced the cost of being unmarried for a long time, and it increased their enrollment in higher levels of human capital development. One of her more recent works, she a couple years ago published a book called Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity, where I highly recommend this book. It has been kind of a constant companion of mine as I do my own research. It's a great reference. It pulls together all of her earlier work. But in this book, she says one of the main drivers of gender inequality in the labor market is the existence of what she calls greedy jobs. Now, it's not greed. Greedy jobs are jobs that require a lot of your time, right? The jobs that require a lot of your time are jobs that are going to come with a big pay premium. And as I said, being a finance person, being a financial advisor, being a lawyer that's trying to make partner, these are jobs that would be considered greedy jobs. In our household bargaining between, who is going to be the primary breadwinner versus who's going to be the primary caregiver, that household division of labor means that somebody is going to sacrifice some of their labor market potential. And the existence of greedy jobs make it more likely that that primary caregiver is going to be the one that suffers. As of right now, gender norms are such that women are primarily that caregiver. So we tend to suffer that wage penalty to a greater degree. So this is some data from the Pew Research Center. It's not from Claudia Goldin's work, but I just want to show you a little bit about how the division of labor in the household actually plays out. So this data is from 2015, so it's a few years old, but I would say it's from the United States. It's not that out of date. This study is pretty interesting. They asked couples, full-time working couples, male-female couples that have kids. They work full-time. They both work full-time. They have kids. They first asked them, what is your perception of how household labor is divided? Do you think that the mom does more, the dad does more? Do you think it's an equitable split? So they ask about taking care of the kids when they're sick, managing their school schedule, packing lunches, and doing other household chores and responsibilities. You could see that both women were more likely to say that they do more of the child rearing activities. Men were more likely to say that we share these responsibilities equally. But then when you actually ask them how they spend their time, not how you perceive the division is going, but how do you actually spend your time, and they track that time, they found that in the average week, men get to spend about 6 hours more in their paid work. They have to spend about 3.5 hours less doing housework. They get to spend about 3.3 hours less per week doing childcare activities. And then they also get to have about 4 hours more per week in leisure. So when we actually ask people how you spend your time, it turns out to be the case that women are shouldering more of these child rearing responsibilities. And that gives men more time to focus on their careers and more time to relax, which helps you be better prepared for doing well at your career. So these division of household labor is a primary driver of these labor force differences between men and women. And it is still the case that gender norms dictate that women are doing more of this. Until we can have gender norms that view the division of household labor as being more equitable, I do not anticipate the gender wage gap completely disappearing. It might narrow, but I don't anticipate it would disappear. There's a lot of extensions of Goldin's work. We don't have a ton of time, so I won't go into detail of these extensions, but they are pretty interesting, especially the one about tenure clock stopping and how gender wage gaps work in the gig economy. But they're just additional studies that kind of reinforce that women get they get penalized for making decisions to have more flexible work. So some of the key findings, Claudia Goldin's work largely concludes that gender differences in labor force participation and in income, it's not because of biological differences, it's not because women are less skilled than men, it's mostly stemming from the division of unpaid caring responsibilities, and if one group is expected to take on more of those responsibilities, then they're going to be disadvantaged in the labor market. So it's not necessarily, sexual discrimination explicitly. It is that we have gender norms that say women should take care of kids and do housework more than men, and that puts us at a different disadvantage. It is the case that gender gaps are different across different professions. So one of the really important things I think that comes out of her work is that professions that do have more flexible work arrangements, are ones that tend to be more friendly to females. There's not that big of a gender wage gap if we are looking at careers that have more flexibility. Pharmacists tend to be mostly women, and the women tend to do better in that field. So it's not consistent across different organizations. There are some really important implications. I think one of the first important implications of Claudia Goldin's work is that women's issues are actually interesting and worthy of study. I definitely got teary when I heard that Claudia Goldin won the Nobel Prize, because it's very rare that people win the Nobel Prize on their own. It's very rare that women win the Nobel Prize, and it's never been the case that anybody has won the Nobel Prize in studying something that is so specifically important to women. So this was just really acknowledgement from the profession that issues that are of importance to women are important to the entire economy and important to the profession. We should try to understand them. Another implication is that we should be really cautious about trying to treat the gender wage gap through policy mandates, because the causes of the gender wage gap are stemming from gender norms. One of the things that she ends on in her career and family book is that we need to focus on changing gender norms. And there's no way to do that via legislation. That takes really hard work in the way that we talk to our kids, in the way that, the fact that Target got rid of their boys' toys versus girls' toys section and it's just toys is huge, because now when I was growing up, all I wanted to do was play with Legos and everybody kept getting me baby dolls and a play kitchen. So these shifts in how we talk to our kids, shifts in that can really go a long way to helping gender norms change. Blind reviewing processes may be actually helpful in reducing gender biases in interviewing and hiring behavior. And the last most important conclusion that I can think of is flexible work arrangements. If we really, really want to help women excel in the labor force, having more flexible work arrangements is really, really key. One of the things that I tend to be optimistic about during COVID. There's not a lot about COVID that made me optimistic, but one of the things that made me kind of optimistic for the future of women is that more jobs permit flexible work arrangements now. There's a lot more remote work, and women are more likely to enter into industries that they couldn't really enter into before if their work arrangements can be more flexible. Like a lot more women can go into tech if we are allowed to work at home. And that can be really, really huge. So I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about Claudia Goldin. I think her work is really important. I think you should all totally go and read it.